My name is Emma Collins, and I'm 28 years old. I was 7 years old the first time my father called me a liar in front of company. We were at my aunt's birthday dinner, and I had accidentally knocked over a glass of juice. I told him it slipped. He looked at the table full of relatives and said, "She always says that. Never her fault." Everyone laughed. I didn't. That moment planted something in me. A quiet, bone-deep understanding that no matter what I said or did, my parents had already decided who I was. And for 21 years after that, I tried to prove them wrong. I dressed right. I spoke carefully. I apologized first, even when I had done nothing wrong. I built myself into someone unrecognizable just to earn a version of love that was always 2 steps ahead of me. Then I met Daniel Hayes. He was 31, a civil engineer with steady hands and an even steadier heart. We met at a rooftop fundraiser 3 years ago. He was there for a colleague. I was there for a client. He spilled his drink on my jacket within 4 minutes of meeting me, apologized so sincerely that I laughed instead of flinching. And by the end of the night, we had exchanged numbers and a conversation that felt like finally exhaling after holding your breath for years. He didn't need me to be smaller. He didn't flinch when I was direct. He asked me questions and actually waited for the answers. After 14 months of dating, he proposed in the kitchen of our apartment. No grand gesture, just him on one knee with a ring his grandmother had left him, and his voice breaking slightly when he said my name. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We set the wedding for a Saturday in late September. The rehearsal dinner was planned for the Friday before, a private room at a restaurant called Wellington's, candles everywhere. Our closest people gathered to celebrate something I had waited my whole life to feel, chosen. My parents had never liked Daniel. My father, Victor Collins, thought he was too quiet, too measured, not impressive enough by the standards he kept in his head like a ledger. My mother, Margaret, smiled at Daniel's face and whispered criticisms about him the moment he left the room. I had kept my distance from their opinions for years by then. I had learned to filter them, but 14 days before my wedding, they did something I could not filter. Daniel called me on a Tuesday afternoon and his voice was different. Not angry, careful, like he was holding something fragile and wasn't sure how hard he could grip it. He told me my parents had come to see him at his office, without telling me, without warning. They sat across from him and told him that I had been pregnant at 22, that I had given birth to a child, and that I had abandoned that baby, walked away without looking back. My father used the word bastard. My mother whispered, like it was a confidence between them, "Don't let her trap you too." Daniel didn't yell at me. He didn't accuse. He just asked quietly if there was anything I needed to tell him. And I sat in my car in a parking garage, with my phone pressed to my ear, and I felt the floor of my chest open up into nothing. Because there was a child. And the story was nothing like what my parents had told him. When I was 22, I was in a relationship with a man named Ryan Parker. He was older, charming in the way that is really just control wearing a better coat. I got pregnant. I was terrified. Ryan was not kind about it. He told me the child wasn't something he wanted, and when I said I wasn't sure what I wanted, he made that decision feel smaller and smaller until I felt like I had no ground to stand on. I carried that pregnancy for 4 months before a miscarriage ended it. Sudden, devastating, and completely out of my hands. There was no birth. There was no baby I walked away from. There was grief that I buried so deep I had not spoken about it to almost anyone, including Daniel, because I had never found the right moment, and because that season of my life had belonged to a version of me I had spent years quietly mourning. My parents knew this. They had been there. My mother had driven me to the hospital. She had held my hand in the waiting room. She knew exactly what had happened and exactly what had not happened. And 14 days before my wedding, she sat across from my fiancé and told him I had abandoned a living child. I drove to Daniel's apartment that night and I told him everything. The pregnancy, the miscarriage, Ryan, the silence I had carried. He listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, he reached across the table and held my hand and said, "I'm so sorry that happened to you." Not, "I'm sorry you didn't tell me." Not, "I'm not sure I believe you." He grieved it with me before he asked a single question. That was the man I was marrying. But the damage my parents had planted was still sitting in the room between us, and I knew it would not disappear just because Daniel was good. My parents had calculated that. They knew a seed of doubt planted close enough to a wedding could split something open that no amount of love could fully close. What they did not calculate was who would walk through the door at our rehearsal dinner the following Friday, and what she would be carrying when she arrived. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be the calm before the beautiful storm of our wedding day. Wellington's restaurant had been transformed into something out of a dream, soft amber lighting draped across exposed brick walls, long tables dressed in cream linen with eucalyptus runners, candles flickering in glass vessels that caught the light and threw it gently across the faces of the people we loved most. Daniel stood near the bar with his brother, laughing at something, his collar open, his eyes finding mine every few minutes across the room the way they always did, like checking that I was still real. For a moment, standing in the doorway in my navy dress, I almost let myself believe that the previous 2 weeks had not happened, that my parents had not done what they had done, that the wound was already sealed. My parents were seated at the far end of the table. My father was on his second drink. My mother was wearing a pale rose blouse, and the particular expression she reserved for occasions where she expected to be photographed, composed, pleasant, performing warmth for an audience that did not know her the way I did. They had called twice since the confrontation with Daniel. I had not answered. They had arrived tonight because I had not yet found the words to uninvite them, and because some exhausted part of me had hoped they would simply sit quietly and let the evening pass without incident. That hope died at 8:17 in the evening when the door to Wellington's private dining room opened and a woman walked in that I had not seen in 6 years. Her name was Claire Donovan. She was 34, lean and composed with dark eyes and the kind of stillness that comes from having survived something significant. She had been my closest friend during the years I was with Ryan Parker. She had held me together through the miscarriage with a steadiness I had never properly thanked her for. We had drifted apart gradually after I left that chapter of my life behind, not in anger, just in the quiet way that sometimes happens when two people associate each other with a pain neither of them wants to keep touching. I had not known she was coming. I had not invited her. I did not understand in the first seconds of seeing her why she was there at all. She walked directly to me, bypassed the greetings and the confusion, and said my name in a voice that was steady, but not casual. She was holding a manila envelope. She said she needed 5 minutes, and that it could not wait. I took her into the small corridor outside the dining room, the noise of the gathering muffled behind the closed door, and she placed the envelope in my hands and told me to open it. Inside were documents. Medical records from the hospital where I had been treated during the miscarriage, a dated discharge summary, a letter from the attending physician, formal and clinical, confirming the pregnancy loss at 17 weeks. And beneath those, a printed series of text messages, screenshots, time-stamped and clear, between my mother, Margaret Collins, and Ryan Parker. The oldest message was from 3 months ago. In it, my mother had reached out to Ryan directly. She had asked him to confirm, if anyone ever asked, that I had given birth to a living child and placed it for adoption without telling him. Ryan, to whatever credit he had refused. He had told her that was not what happened and that he wanted no part of it. My mother had pushed twice more. He had stopped responding. Claire had obtained these because Ryan, feeling uneasy about the exchange, had contacted her. They had stayed loosely in touch over the years, and she had driven 4 hours to make sure I had them before I stood at any altar. I stood in that corridor for a long moment with the papers in my hands, and something very quiet happening in the center of my chest. It was not rage, exactly. It was something older and more complete than rage. It was the specific grief of finally having proof of something you had always known, but could never say out loud, that your parents were not just flawed or fearful, but deliberately, calculatedly cruel in a way that had nothing to do with protecting you and everything to do with controlling the shape of your life. I walked back into the dining room. Daniel read my face before I said a word and came to stand beside me without being asked. I set the envelope on the table in front of my father and my mother, in front of our guests, in front of the candles and the eucalyptus and the beautiful room that was supposed to hold only celebration. I did not raise my voice. I had spent too many years being loud in empty rooms to waste the quiet I had finally built. I told them, clearly and without performance, what the documents contained. I told everyone present what my parents had attempted to do 14 days before my wedding. My father's jaw tightened. My mother looked at the tablecloth. Neither of them spoke. I asked them to leave. They left. The room was silent for a moment that felt long. Then Daniel's mother, a woman named Alina who had never once been anything but kind to me, stood up and began to applaud. Slowly at first, and then the whole table joined. And I stood there in the amber light of Wellington's, with my fiancé's hand in mine, and Claire across the table watching me with wet eyes. And I let the sound wash over every year I had ever spent being called a liar in rooms where no one defended me. We got married that Saturday. The ceremony was small, honest, and completely ours. My parents were not there. That was not a tragedy. That was a boundary I had finally stopped apologizing for. Daniel cried during his vows. I let him finish before I cried through mine. Claire sat in the front row and handed me a tissue at exactly the right moment, the way she always had. I am Emma Collins, soon to be Emma Hayes, and I am 28 years old. I spent most of those years believing that the people who should have loved me unconditionally had somehow gotten a version of me that deserved less. I know now that was never true. Some people do not stop controlling you because they change. They stop because you finally walk out of reach, and you build something so solid and so real that their words no longer have a wall to echo off of. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever sat in a room where someone rewrote your truth and no one stood up, I want you to know that the rehearsal dinner is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is exactly where your real life begins. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. Every story shared here carries a lesson, a truth, or a moment someone out there desperately needed to hear. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story, because sometimes the most powerful endings are only the beginning of something better.